The world of the Transformers is filled with a broad, assorted cast of heroes and villains spanning a range of different roles and characteristics. They made their mark in the toy and entertainment industries as form-changing machines that switch between a robot mode and other modes serving various purposes. Through the years, you'd see robots shifting into cars, airplanes, handheld items, combiners, defense bases, and countless other alternate transformation states to flesh out their seemingly limitless collection of characters. In the opening year of 1984, the Transformers were considered as fresh, new, and exciting, and as the years went on, owner company Hasbro would need to adopt further gimmicks to keep the brand as top of mind for a young audience looking to consume the latest product and media offerings. That said, by 1988, the Transformers were a mainstay in the realm of action figures. Attempts to stay relevant and popular meant incorporating never-before-seen concepts into their toy line, all in hopes of maintaining their standing as a key franchise. A franchise that in fact shook the industry years earlier with their sentient, likable product line of robots, and Hasbro was going to do everything in their power to keep a good thing going. So let's take a look at the dynamic cast of characters in this particular year, because this is the story of the Transformers in 1988. Let's begin. While Hasbro will always be credited for bringing the Transformers into relevance for Western markets, it's important to focus as well on the contributions of the Japanese-based Takara toy company that was responsible for distributing the Transformers in other parts of the globe. Takara was indeed the company whose original tooling enabled Hasbro to create the fictional world of the Transformers to begin with just a few years earlier. And while only a few selected figures in prior years would be exclusive to one market or another, with fans in one part of the globe likely being unaware of such regional limitations, 1988 is noteworthy for having a greater amount of differences in figure offerings from one global area to the next. This, of course, is particularly evident with the sheer amount of items available exclusively to Japan and distributed by Takara, and vice versa, some items were exclusively distributed by Hasbro in Western regions, creating a bit of a divergence in available offerings depending on where you lived. As such, the discussion here will focus on both the American-based Hasbro Toy Company releases and the Japanese-based Takara releases, noting some key differences throughout, though we certainly can't cover everything off in a single video release. At this point, let's take the time machine back a few decades to see the world of entertainment in the year of 1988 that the Transformers found itself integrated in. Here in the US, we'd hear some great rock music songs that would begin in this year and continue to get airplay as the years went on. Television would give us more in the way of sitcoms as well as various drama series, and also expand the world of animation to go along with the Saturday morning cartoon genre. And the box office also gave us a lot of memories, with films that would evolve into all-time classics that people at the time, as well as future generations, would grow to appreciate. The widespread pastime of video gaming had already existed for a good period of time, but 1988 saw an expansion of this both in the form of large coin-operated arcade machines as well as domestic in-house consoles. Closer to the world of robot animation, Japan would see the release of Mobile Suit Gundam Char's Counterattack, a film that would feature the final showdown and fitting end to the rivalry between ace pilots Amuro Ray and Char Aznable. And of course, the Transformers in 1988 would release their Super God Masterforce cartoon, spanning a full season and continuing the Japanese animated timeline from the previous year's Transformers The Headmasters cartoon. The Super God Masterforce series was not aired in the United States as the American animated timeline concluded the prior year. Note that Super God Masterforce, like other Transformers Japanese series, is presented quite differently from what fans in Western markets are familiar with. For the toy line itself, we'd get a significant expansion to the ranks of both the Autobots and the Decepticons, or if you prefer, They were referred to as Cybertrons and Destrons respectively in Japan. A key gimmick this year, which was a huge deviation from past releases, was the introduction of the Pretenders subteam into the lineup. In North America, the Pretenders were advertised as humanoid or monster-like shells that could literally split open and reveal a transformer inside.
Pretenders hide the Transformers inside!
This naturally gave you a great 2-in-1 feature when you purchased the toy. Likewise, in the Marvel Comics, they were portrayed in a similar way, whereby the inner robot was the actual Transformer and the robot could operate its shell via remote like a drone. However, in the Super God Masterforce Japanese cartoon, the Pretenders were characters who would morph from one state to another, going from their disguised human or monster form into their robot form and back. As such, this outer form and the inner Transformer were considered one and the same, thus not featuring them as being separate. The Autobot Pretenders this year consisted of an initial 1988 wave. You had Landmine, or Lander as he was referred to in Japan, and of note in Japan he was a mail-away figure, albeit he was a standard retail release in North America. You also had Wave Rider, and he was known as Diver in Japan, as well as Cloudburst, who in Japan went by the name of Phoenix. And while these three are often considered as the main Autobot Pretenders, being released in both markets and being featured heavily in the Masterforce cartoon, the Pretender leader in the Masterforce cartoon was Metalhawk. Released only in Japan by Takara, in the initial part of the Masterforce cartoon, Metalhawk called the shots as a senior member of the hero ranks, and his inner robot's gold color scheme obviously makes the figure quite a standout in this range. Like many of the Japanese-only releases in this year, Metalhawk is considered as something of a holy grail piece for Transformers collectors. The rest of the heroic Pretenders this year were not released in Japan. A follow-up wave consisted of Sky High, Groundbreaker, and Splashdown. You also had the Pretender Beasts, who used an animalistic shell rather than a human one. This consisted of Catilla, as well as Chainclaw. The Pretender Vehicles had a figure ride inside a vehicle shell rather than a human or animal one, and the Autobots had a figure named Gunrunner to represent them on that front. And another new gimmick this year was the Powermasters. Like the Targetmasters and Headmasters, the Powermasters would transform, now into engines to binary bond to their larger Transformers partners. The most significant of these was of course Powermaster Optimus Prime.
Powermaster Optimus Prime, greatest leader of his time.
In the comics, Optimus Prime had died and returned as a Powermaster bonded to a Nebulan by the name of High-Q. This feature-heavy toy had a smaller robot mode, a battle station mode, a truck mode, and a larger combined robot mode. High-Q was quite important in the Marvel Comics for helping to bring Optimus back to life. In Japan, the Powermasters were called Godmasters, and in the Japanese Super God Masterforce continuity, the Powermaster or Godmaster wasn't Optimus Prime himself, but rather a non-sentient robot or a Transtector as referred to in this timeline. Transtectors refer to all of the non-sentient bots who were bonded to a smaller partner. In Japan, the smaller organic partner wasn't a Nebulan at all and was a human known as Ginrai. Thus, when bonded to the Transtector, the robot is also known as Ginrai or Super Ginrai when he takes on the larger robot mode that combines with the trailer. It does get confusing as this robot takes on the appearance of Optimus Prime even if he's not Optimus himself. Ginrai's Transtector specifically would sometimes act on its own and display a will of its own, much to Ginrai's surprise. It's also worth adding that the reason Ginrai, be it in his regular mode or in his Super Ginrai mode, looks like Optimus Prime is because the Transtector was initially meant to be used by Optimus himself. That said, Optimus had died yet again in the previous year's Transformers: The Headmasters cartoon series. Super Ginrai also had a second trailer attachment known as God Bomber. As a toy, God Bomber is what collectors call as a parts former, as in you would literally have to take the whole figure apart to either put him into his trailer mode or his robot mode. But ultimately, he could separate into additional armor pieces that you'd put onto Super Ginrai to make a fully combined mode called God Ginrai. God Ginrai is a firm staple and an icon in the Japanese Transformers continuity and a must-have for many collections. Ginrai would eventually become the leader when Metalhawk stepped down from this role. The three heroic Powermasters who accompanied Ginrai or Prime included Slapdash, along with his Nebulan partner named Lube. And yes, let the jokes begin. His name was literally Lube. Slapdash was sold in Japan as Road King. We also had Getaway, who was sold with his Nebulan partner named Rev. In Japan, Getaway went by the name of Lightfoot, and finally we have Joyride, along with his partner Hotwire. Joyride was sold by the name of Ranger in Japan. And note that Ranger had a lighter color scheme. Also, the North American color scheme was available in Japan as a mail-away. Takara also had a variant colorway for the three Godmaster engines that we just talked about. These figures went by the names of Zetka, Bullet, and Aquastar. The Headmaster gimmick returned this year as well. This set is often referred to as Headmaster Juniors, which is fitting given that the Headmasters that were bonded to the Transtectors in the Masterforce cartoon were quite literally children. For this subset, we'll start with the Japanese releases, beginning with Go Shooter, who is the form taken by the kid Shuta when he merges with his Transtector. Shuta was a primary character in the Masterforce cartoon. There was also a female in the line who was named Minerva, another grail piece that commands a high price on the secondary market. And then there's Cab, whose headmaster character was a literal prince of an island region in the cartoon. These kids are often shown hanging out in the cartoon, be it in human form or when bonded to their Transtectors. In North America, Go Shooter was recolored into Siren, whose headmaster was known as Quig, and while Go Shooter was the standard release in Japan, the Siren recolor was released in Japan as a mail-away. Same goes for Nightbeat, who was the standard release in North America, but a mail-away in Japan. Nightbeat is the Autobot detective with a Nebulan partner named Muzzle. Nightbeat is noteworthy for getting a bit of a boost in his status during the 2000s, as he got both a Transformers Club exclusive figure as well as a featured IDW Transformer Spotlight issue during this time frame. Cab was called Hosehead for Western markets, with a Nebulon partner named Lug, and was virtually the same figure as the Japanese release, so that summarizes the three North American figures for these Headmasters. And just like in the 1987 year, we'd get a giant Headmaster in this follow-up series as well. As such, we were introduced to Grand Maximus, the brother of the previous year's Fortress Maximus. He's a recolor of the 1987 figure, and like his brother, Grand Maximus came as a headmaster whose head had his own headmaster, thus doubling up on that particular gimmick. And like the Japanese release of Fortress Maximus, Grand Maximus came with a large sword to match with the towering figure. Grand Maximus was a toy that featured multiple gimmicks, given that he also came with a Pretender shell for his head when it was converted into robot form. The whole Grand Maximus set is another super high-end piece this year that doesn't pop up for sale very often. Like the Headmasters, the Targetmaster gimmick returned this year as well, with a trio of Autobot construction vehicles taking a page out of the 1985 Constructicon's playbook. Interestingly, these Targetmasters came with two Nebulan partners instead of one. There's Landfill, the dump truck with his partners Silencer and Flintlock. You also have Quick Mix, the mixing truck with his Targetmaster duo of Ricochet and Boomer. And finally, you have Scoop, the front-end loader with his Nebulan pair named Tracer and Hole Punch. There was also yet another Autobot trio this year known as the Triggerbots. Known for being able to spring their weapons into battle-ready form when you press the switch on the figure, they consisted of Backstreet, Override, and Dogfight. On top of all that, there was still yet another group of three known as the Sparkabots. The Sparkabots could literally shoot up sparks when you rolled them forward in their alternate mode. You had Fizzle, released by Hasbro, but he had a slight variation in color when released by Takara, where he took the name of Wild Spark. You also had Sizzle, which was his Hasbro name and released as Hot Spark by Takara in Japan. And rounding out this small group is Guzzle, a Hasbro release who got to spend some time as a member of the Wreckers faction in the comics, particularly during the events of IDW's well-written Last Stand of the Wreckers comic series in 2010. He was recolored into Hard Spark for his Japanese release. The Autobot cassettes also returned to flesh out the ranks of either Blaster or Twincast's small army. Grand Slam and Rain Dance joined the lineup, and interestingly, they could form together into a cassette combiner going by the joint name of Slam Dance. We then get to an important offering this year with the revisitation of the Transformers 6-changer gimmick, meaning the toy needed to be engineered to have 6 total transformation modes. The Hasbro release was known as Quick Switch and was said to be the son of Six Shot as per the commercial, albeit Quick Switch is an Autobot and not a Decepticon. The mold was recolored into Six Knight, who like many Japanese releases has become quite desirable over the years by collectors. 6 different modes like these gives such toys a lot of play value and a leg up on the battlefield when they're taking on the Decepticons, or Destrons in Japan if you prefer. The Masterforce cartoon shows Six Knight as being a warrior who desired to prove himself in combat. He was certainly a deadly fighter, but also had a sense of honor. Now, while Quick Switch is said to be Six Shot's son, Six Knight was never mentioned in such context in the Masterforce cartoon and is simply known to be another ninja robot who came from the same clan as Six Shot. This helps to segregate Six Knight and Quick Switch as different characters, and take note that IDW comic writer Nick Roach has considered them to be different characters as well. We can then round out the Autobot discussion with the mention of these Transform Junior figures of Ginrai and his various modes, as well as a junior toy of Grand Maximus, all released by Takara. And while that covers the cast of heroic Autobots, we need to talk about the Decepticons in this year as well. The villain ranks largely consisted of equal and opposite subgroupings, including many of the same gimmicks and features as our heroes. The Decepticons or Destrons had a slew of pretenders as well, sporting a monster-type look to counteract the more human-looking Autobot pretenders. The main 3 consisted of Bombburst, who went by the name of Blood over in Japan and served as leader of this sub-faction. You had Submarauder, who was called Gilmer for his Takara release, and Skullgrid, or Dalros if you prefer the overseas name. These 3 were often seen working together during the Super God Masterforce cartoon and are the main villains at the start of the series. Like with the Autobots, the other Decepticon pretenders sold by Hasbro greatly outnumbered those sold by Takara. A second group of 3 consisted of Finback, as well as Bugley, and then Iguanus. The Decepticons also had their pretender beasts to battle the Autobot ones, and these consisted of Carnivac, as well as Snarler. They also had their own pretender vehicle, who went by the name of Road Grabber. The Decepticon Powermasters had some very key releases this year. The main aerial pair consisted of Dreadwind, along with his Powermaster partner High Test, who is a friend of High-Q, which was Powermaster Optimus Prime's partner in the Marvel comic before they came into conflict with one another. And you had Darkwing, along with his Nebulan partner Throttle. For the Japanese release, the pair was recolored as Dreadwind was done up as Buster and Darkwing was done up as Hydra. A pair of Godmaster brothers in the Masterforce cartoon, these 2 would often be at odds with their fellow villains, largely due to their own overconfidence in their own skills. Both the North American pair and the Japanese pair had a combined aerial mode, and this was called the Darkwings mode for the purpose of the Japanese continuity. The Darkwings set could be bought as a multi-pack containing both Hydra and Buster as a toy, or the 2 could be bought separately. Another Powermaster this year was Double Dealer. Now, he came with 2 Powermasters because he could either be an Autobot or a Decepticon. While he's in his robot mode, he features the Autobot symbol, but his box features the Decepticon logo and art style, hence why he's covered off here in this particular section. That and the similarly themed double agent from 1987, named Punch, or Counterpunch if you prefer, was featured in Autobot packaging, so I guess this evens things out. Double Dealer was a mercenary working for the highest bidder. As such, his official Decepticon mode is that of a Falcon, and his vehicle mode is that of a neutral Allegiance. His Powermasters went by the name of Knock, an Autobot, and Scar, who was a Decepticon. This mold was used to make Double Clouder in Japan, who had a metallic chest plate and some different coloring details. Now, if there was one Powermaster, or Godmaster if you prefer, who was a popular Holy Grail piece in the Transformers toy line, that would be Overlord here. This was the Godmaster that largely called the shots for the Destrons in the Masterforce cartoon, serving as their battlefield leader and being dubbed as their Ambassador of Destruction. He only answered to one higher being who was known as Devil Z, or Devil Z if you prefer. As a toy, he had a base mode and could also be disconnected into separate tank and jet units. It was a feature-heavy toy, making it quite desirable amongst collectors, and his robot mode was one of the taller ones in the line. You can have a look at him here next to 1986's Triptychon, as well as 1987's Scorponok, just for comparison's sake. His Godmasters were known as Giga and Mega, a pair that played a huge role in the Masterforce cartoon. Depending who you ask, many would say that this is the quintessential piece in the 1988 toy line. Take note that he was released not only in Japan, but also saw a European release by Hasbro. The Hasbro and Takara releases are very similar, though the purple parts and accessories will be of a lighter or darker color shade depending on which version you find. 1988 also had a Decepticon wave of Headmasters, and like the Autobot grouping, these three made a big impact in the Japanese cartoon. You had Fangry, along with his Nebulan Headmaster Briscoe, and he was called Wilder in Japan. Wilder spent time as a gang member prior to joining the Destron Headmaster crew. There's Horrible with his Headmaster Kreb, and the character was called Bullhorn in the Masterforce animated series. Then you also had Squeezeplay, who was paired up with Locos, and he was known as Cancer, just like the Zodiac symbol, for the Masterforce cartoon. All three were often seen together during the Japanese animated series, and the character of Cancer in particular showed a softer side throughout the run, developing an affinity for the good guy ranks, particularly for the female Minerva. In the cartoon, Cancer was gifted with a mini transformer named Browning, who served as something of a pet. Browning was oftentimes used for comic relief, and his figure was a reuse and recolor of the Takara Microchange Gun Robo MC-07 from years earlier. And we can round out the Headmaster discussion here. The largest Decepticon, or Destron Headmaster, was Black Zarak. A recolor and slight retool of the previous year's Scorponok, Black Zarak is something of a secret weapon for the Destron ranks. Do take note though that pricey as this figure is, his gold pieces are prone to gold plastic syndrome, meaning that they tend to degrade faster than other plastics used. For the double target masters, the Decepticons have their grouping as well, and just like the Autobots, they were all released by Hasbro and not by Takara. You had Spinister with his Nebulan pair of Singe and Hair Splitter. There's Quake, who's partnered up with Tip Top and Heater, as well as Needlenose, whose target masters went by the names of Sunbeam and Zigzag. To battle the Trigger Bots, the Decepticons had the Triggercons, and were also a Hasbro release that were not picked up by Takara. These similarly spring-loaded bots consisted of Crankcase, as well as Ruckus, and then Windsweeper. And to go up against the Sparkabots, the Decepticons had their own Spark Shooter toys, namely the Firecons, consisting of both Hasbro and Takara releases. There's Cindersaur, the North American release, recolored as Guzzle in Japan. And yes, Guzzle is also the name of one of the Sparkabots. There's Flame Feather, who is named Sizzle in Japan, taking yet another Sparkabot's name, and of course creating a bit of confusion for us as collectors, though at least this figure didn't have a recolor between the domestic and overseas versions, keeping them the same. And then there's Sparkstalker, who was recolored and renamed as Javel in Japan. And because it seemed like nearly every Autobot had an equal and opposite Decepticon this year, here's the cassette pair of Squawk Talk and Beast Box to bolster the ranks of Soundwave or Sound Blaster, and when combined, they form Squawk Box to go up against the Autobot combined cassette pair of Slam Dance. The Decepticons also had a full combiner team this year, which was the only traditional style combiner released for 1988. Here's the group known as the Seacons, consisting of Nautilator, Overbite, Seawing, Scalor, Tentakill, and the team leader, Snaptrap. Their merged form is known as Piranacon, though he went by the more fitting name of King Poseidon for his Japanese Takara release. That covers the physical toy line itself, though the notion of Transformers in 1988 could in theory splinter off into many subtopics. For example, there are certain minor paint color variations between releases, like you see for Wave Rider here in terms of his hair color if you decide to leave his helmet off. Additionally, there's also the fact that some people like owning both the Takara Super Ginrai and Hasbro Powermaster Optimus, particularly due to the differences like the Takara one having sliding fists for his transformation and the various chrome details on the Takara version, among other things. The mold was so popular that there'd even be recolors in the early 2000s, such as the limited edition black-colored Nucleon Quest Super Convoy, as well as the Fire Guts God Ginrai. That's all in addition to the full-on reissues of God Ginrai by Takara and an equivalent Hasbro release that had the set called as Powermaster Optimus Prime, along with Apex armor. That is, with God Bomber being renamed into Apex Bomber and being able to transform into an armor set or into a second trailer attachment like he did back in 1988. The cartoon definitely comes recommended, as it serves as the 5th season of the Generation 1 Transformers animation timeline. It does alternate between being a bit campy as well as being very serious, but of note, it is meant to be viewed more like traditional anime, which differentiates it largely from the English-speaking cartoons in earlier years. The cartoon also deviates hugely from the old-school cast of characters that most Transformers fans are used to. Yes, the previous year's Transformers the Headmasters cartoon does do this to some degree as well, but with the number of characters from earlier years who were shown throughout the Headmasters run, this feels more like a softer transition compared to Masterforce, which very much does its own thing, albeit still maintaining the core essence of what the Transformers is known for. While there wasn't an American-based cartoon for the 1988 year, the reruns of earlier years would be shown, and those episodes would be bookended with live-action sequences of a boy named Tommy Kennedy having various conversations with Powermaster Optimus Prime. Prime would narrate the old episodes that aired as reruns while Tommy would listen. Thus, we would get some minimal new footage for 1988 added in as starting and ending sequences for existing older episodes. Overall, fans can decide for themselves if they like what this year of Transformers had to offer. It's worth pointing out that in 1988, at least in Western markets, the Transformers, along with other similar Hasbro brands, were giving up ground to new toy lines that were picking up popularity at the time. That said, the Transformers would be back for a 1989 year to close out the 1980s as a decade overall, and would still see life as a toy line heading into the 1990s. And if you enjoyed this video, don't go anywhere just yet. I'm going to put the rest of my Transformers history playlist, which you can click on right over here, or for a look at an altogether different toy history topic, you can click right over here. And with that, let's transform and roll out into the next video. See you next time.